There is an old idea that lives beneath this story, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we begin, because it shapes everything that will follow. The idea is that the world turns in cycles, not in the simple sense of seasons returning or stars wheeling overhead, though those turnings are present too and they are part of the larger pattern. The deeper turning is a turning of the soul. Somewhere in the long, quiet architecture of this world, there is a single spirit that returns again and again across the centuries and the millennia, taking up in each lifetime a new body and a new name and a new set of small tender attachments, and holding, through the fact of its returning, the balance that the world requires in order to remain a world. Tonight, we are going to follow that turning, not quickly, not by the shortest road, but all the way back, patiently, to the place before the cycle began, when human beings did not yet walk upon the earth but lived above it, and the world was a very different kind of place. Settle in. There is no hurry here. To understand what the Avatar is, you must first understand what the world was like before there were any avatars at all, and this turns out to be a longer and quieter story than most tellings of it suggest. There was a time in the deep ancestral memory of this world when the arrangement of everything was different in ways that are not easy to imagine from inside the familiar geography of the four nations. There were no nations then. There were no cities that stood upon the earth, no farms that worked its soil, no roads that connected one human settlement to another across the open land. The ground itself was not a place where human beings lived. It was rather a place that human beings visited, briefly and cautiously, and always with the understanding that they were visiting something that belonged to someone else, and that the owners of the ground were not patient and not gentle, and not in the habit of welcoming small and noisy creatures into their domain. The ground belonged, in that ancient age, to the spirits, and the spirits of the early world were not the remote and philosophical beings that later ages would come to imagine them as being. They were wild and they were present, and they were, in the most immediate and physical sense, everywhere. The spirit world and the physical world were not separate realms in those days, divided by any clear membrane of access. They overlapped, they interpenetrated. A forest was not simply a forest, but was also, simultaneously, the home and the expression, and in some sense the actual body of the spirit that inhabited it. A river was a spirit moving, a mountain was a spirit sleeping. The weather was the mood of beings whose moods could not be reasoned with. And for a small, warm-blooded, slow-moving mammal with no natural armour and no particular gifts of speed or strength, walking out upon such ground was not a casual thing. It was a negotiation, at best. At worst, it was a mistake that one did not live long enough to regret. And so humans, in the time before the Avatar, did not live upon the ground. They lived above it. The lion turtles carried them. This is one of the most extraordinary facts in the deep cosmology of this world, and it is a fact that tends to be forgotten, or remembered only dimly, because the age of the lion turtles ended so long ago that by the time the story most people know begins, the lion turtles themselves had passed almost entirely into legend. But they were real, and they were present, and in the first age of human existence they were the whole of human civilization's foundation. They were vast beyond the mortal imagining of vastness, beings of such immense proportion that a city of several thousand people could be built upon the shell of a single one, with houses and gardens and meeting halls and quiet corners, and the lion turtle carrying all of this would not particularly notice the weight. They were intelligent, in a slow and deliberate way that made the intelligence of human beings seem, by comparison, almost hasty. They had been alive, each of them, for ages beyond reckoning, and they had chosen, for reasons that belonged to their own long and patient ethics, to carry the human species upon their backs, and to guard it, and to permit it to grow. There were only a small number of the lion turtles, and each of them was bonded to a particular element. There was the lion turtle of Earth, whose shell held the largest of the early human cities, a place of gardens and careful stonework that travelled across the continent at the slow, deliberate pace of a being who saw no reason to hurry. There was the lion turtle of Fire, whose city was wreathed in the gentle perpetual warmth of the spirit it carried. There was the lion turtle of Water, whose shell moved across the seas and rivers of the world, the city upon it understanding the tides as its neighbours understood the turning of the days. And there was the lion turtle of Air, whose city rose highest of all, moving with the winds, its inhabitants breathing the thinner air of the upper altitudes and learning, across generations, to love the particular clarity that belonged to heights. Each lion turtle was its own civilization, its own small world, and the humans who lived upon it were, in a real sense, the children of its patience. The humans of those cities could not bend. This is perhaps the most important fact to hold in mind as we sit with this earliest age, because it reverses so much of what the later world would assume to be natural. Bending, the ability to move the elements through one's own will and body, the power that in later ages would be so distributed throughout the four nations that entire cultures would be built around it, did not belong to human beings. It belonged to the lion turtles. And when a human was required to venture down from the safety of the shell into the wilds of the spirit-haunted earth for the purposes of gathering food or water or materials that the city above could not produce for itself, the lion turtle would grant that human, for the duration of the venture and no longer, the temporary gift of the element the turtle carried. The human would descend. The human would gather what was needed. The human would return to the city, and upon returning would give the element back and become, once again, simply a human, with no bending of their own. This was the original arrangement, and it had held in one form or another for a very long time. The ventures down were dangerous. The spirits of the wilds did not recognize the small bending gift that a human had been temporarily loaned as legitimate ownership of anything. A human who descended from the lion turtle carrying fire within their palms was still, from the perspective of an ancient forest spirit, simply an uninvited visitor. And a forest spirit had any number of ways of expressing its opinion about uninvited visitors. Some humans did not return from their ventures down. The cities above learned to grieve, and to remember, and to continue. It was for the whole of that first age the condition of being alive as a human being in this world. The understanding that one lived upon the patient back of a lion turtle, and that the world beneath one's city was vast and beautiful, and did not particularly love you. But the arrangement, for all its dangers, had a kind of settled rightness to it, that the later world would find difficult to appreciate. The humans of those cities were small, and the spirits were vast, and there was a proportionality in that smallness that shaped everything about how those early humans understood themselves. They did not imagine themselves to be the centre of the world. They did not imagine that the world existed for them, or owed them anything, or was waiting to be shaped to their purposes. They lived inside a much larger reality, most of which was not theirs and did not wish to be theirs, and they held that understanding with a kind of quiet humility that, looking back from the far later ages of the four nations, can seem almost like a lost grace. And yet, even in that ancient age, something was beginning to gather. Not a crisis, not an event, but a pressure, the slow accumulation of a mood in the spirit world that was not entirely well. Rava and Vatu, the two great spirits of order and chaos, were locked in their eternal turning against each other, and the balance between them was, by imperceptible degrees, beginning to tilt. The harmonic convergence that would change everything was drawing nearer, an alignment of the planets that occurred only once in every 10,000 years, and that would, when it came, open a door between the two worlds and determine for the age that followed whether it would be light or darkness that governed the long, slow breathing of reality. The lion turtles could feel the pressure gathering. The spirits of the wilds could feel it. And somewhere on the back of the lion turtle of fire, in the small alleys of a city that carried itself across the world on the shell of an ancient patient being, a man named One was beginning to live the ordinary, obscure and slightly troubled early chapters of a life that would, in ways he could not yet imagine, become the hinge on which the entire future of the world would eventually turn. The pressure that had been gathering in the spirit world, the slow tilt of the balance, the quiet approach of the harmonic convergence that would determine the shape of the age to come, all of this was present in the world before it had a name that One, or any other human being, could have given it. What One knew, as he lived his small and obscure life on the back of the lion turtle of fire in the twilight years before everything changed, was only that the world he lived in was not quite a fair one, and that he was not, by the measure of that world, one of the people it had been designed to treat well. He was a thief. This is a fact that most later tellings of his story tend to soften, or to frame as a kind of charming picaresque inconvenience, but the texts that survive about Wen are quite direct about it. He stole food. He stole it because he was hungry, and because the arrangement of wealth on the lion turtle's back had concentrated the food in the hands of people who had more of it than they needed, and because no one, in the particular small city where he lived, was especially interested in finding a better arrangement for the boy with no family and no obvious place in the patient machinery of the community. He was not alone in this. There was a small group of them, the outcasts and the undersized and the otherwise invisible, who had worked out between them a modest and entirely survivable scheme of petty theft that kept them fed without provoking the city's authorities into any particular response. They had names for each other, and a certain rough kinship and the particular quality of loyalty that forms between people who have been told by the larger community that they do not quite count. One was, within this small society, something like a leader, not by declaration, not by any formal selection, but by the simple quiet fact that the others tended to look to him when the plans needed making, and he tended to make them without being asked. He was clever, he was not cruel, and he carried within him even then a quality that would become clearer as his life unfolded, a capacity to notice and to care about the small sufferings of beings who were not himself, a capacity that the circumstances of his life had given him every reason to suppress, and that he had, for reasons of his own that he could not have explained, declined to suppress. It was this capacity that brought about the great turning of his early life, though he did not recognize it as a turning at the time. There was in the arrangement of the city upon the shell of the lion turtle of fire a practice that had developed across generations in which those who were going to venture down into the wilds would be given the bending of fire for the duration of the venture, and would return it upon coming back. This was, as we have said, the original arrangement that all the lion turtles maintained. What had happened in the particular city of the lion turtle of fire by the time one came into his young adulthood was that the bending of fire had become something like a tool of social control, granted with ceremony, revoked with ceremony, and used by those who briefly possessed it as a marker of status that distinguished the ventured from the unventured, the useful from the useless, the fully human from the not quite fully human. One who had no family and no social standing was never going to be chosen to venture, and one who had watched his small companions go hungry because none of them could hunt in the wilds without the bending they were not permitted to borrow, decided, with a quiet and entirely unwise clarity, to take the bending anyway. He stole fire from the lion turtle. This is not quite the right way to describe what he did. One cannot steal from a lion turtle in the way that one steals a fruit from a merchant's stall, because the lion turtle is aware of everything that happens upon its shell at all times, and the granting of bending is a matter of the turtle's own deliberate consent. What one did was petition the lion turtle directly, in a way that the authorities of the city would not have sanctioned, and the lion turtle, who had been watching this particular human for some time with a patient interest that was not easily interpreted, granted the bending to him, and permitted him to take it into the wilds for longer than the usual venture, and to use it for purposes the city authorities had not approved. The consequences of this petitioning, when they were discovered, were severe. One was banished from the city. The bending was not taken back from him. The lion turtle, for reasons that belonged to its own deep understanding of what was coming, allowed him to keep it, and sent him down into the wilds with the fire still alive within his hands, and told him that he would not be permitted to return. And so one, who had intended only to feed his friends, found himself a solitary man walking through the spirit-haunted world below, with a bending gift he had never been intended to keep, and no community at all to return to. It would have been, by any reasonable reckoning, a death sentence. The wilds were not a place where a solitary human being, however gifted with fire, was expected to survive for very long. The spirits of those places had any number of ways of dealing with small, warm-blooded trespassers, and a man alone, without the protection of a city upon the back of a lion turtle, would ordinarily have been reduced quite quickly to the small sad category of humans who did not come back. But one did not die. This is the first of the quiet miracles of his life, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because the reason he did not die was not that he was particularly strong or particularly cunning, but that he was, in the deep and unusual way we have already begun to notice, capable of a certain quality of attention toward beings other than himself. He learned, across the early months of his solitary wandering, to listen to the spirits, not to command them, which he could not have done, and not to flee from them, which would have exhausted him, but to listen, to approach their territories with a quality of respect that the ordinary ventured human, on the brief and defensive errands of city life, had never bothered to cultivate. The spirits, in their various ways, noticed this. Some of them continued to be dangerous. Some of them, more than one had initially expected, did not. And gradually, across a period of months and then of years, he found that he was not simply surviving in the wilds, but was, in a strange and unexpected way, belonging to them, travelling with groups of wild animals who had accepted his presence, resting in places that spirits had permitted him to rest, learning a kind of wilderness citizenship that no human being, as far as he knew, had ever held before. And yet this wandering, however gentle it had become, was still not the arrival at the place he was meant to arrive. The thing that would change the entire trajectory of his life, and with it the future of the world, had not yet happened. It happened in a forest. The forest itself is not named with any particular clarity in the surviving accounts, which is perhaps fitting, because what one found there did not belong to any geography that later maps would bother to record. He was walking in the particular absent-minded way that he had developed across his years of solitary travel, when he heard the sounds of a struggle, not the ordinary sounds of animals hunting or being hunted, but something deeper, something that made the air itself feel strained, as though the fabric of the place were bearing a weight it was barely able to hold. And when he pressed through the trees toward the source of the sound, he found two enormous spirits locked in combat in a clearing, and the combat was of a kind that he understood, immediately and without being told, had been going on for a very long time. One of the spirits was light. This is the simplest description, and it is inadequate, because what Rava was cannot be reduced to any single element or quality, but when one first saw her she was bright and pale and tangled together with her opponent in a tight knot of ancient effort. The other spirit was darkness. Vatu was black and many-armed, and possessed of the particular unrestful quality that belongs to beings whose nature is the disruption of whatever order exists around them. One did not know either of their names. He did not know what their combat meant. What he knew was that one of them appeared to be losing, and that it was his habit across the long course of his life to help the one who was losing, and so he did. He helped the wrong one. This is the second of the quiet miracles of his life, and it is a miracle that wears the shape of a mistake, because one, not understanding what he was looking at, perceived Vatu as the creature being harmed, and Rava as the aggressor, and he intervened on Vatu's behalf. He distracted Rava with fire. He permitted Vatu to slip away from the grip in which Rava had been holding him, and Vatu, freed for the first time in what Rava would later tell him was 10,000 years, spoke to one with a voice that sounded, to the ears of a man who had spent too long alone in the wilderness, something very close to gratitude. Vatu told him that Rava was the darkness of the world, and that he, Vatu, was the light, and one who had no means of checking this claim accepted it. And Vatu departed into the forest, and one was left alone with Rava, who had been released from the locked struggle of the ages by the intervention of a small, well-meaning, entirely ignorant human being who had just, with the best of intentions, released the destruction of the world. The education of Wan began in that clearing and continued across the months that followed, as Rava, furious and weakened and unable to pursue Vatu on her own, attached herself to Wan and began, with a degree of patience that did not come naturally to her, to explain to him what he had done. The truth was the reverse of what Vatu had told him. Rava was the spirit of light and peace, and the preservation of balance. Vatu was the spirit of chaos and darkness, and the dissolution of all settled things. They had been locked in struggle since the beginning of the age, with Rava, by a small but decisive margin, holding the upper hand. And the upper hand had been necessary, because every 10,000 years the planets aligned in a particular configuration called the harmonic convergence, and whichever of the two spirits was dominant at that moment would define the character of the age to follow. The next harmonic convergence was, Rava told him with a kind of weary precision, rather close. And Vatu, thanks to Wan, was now free to gather his strength for it. Wan received this information with the quiet dismay of a man who is being told, in reasonable and accurate terms, that he has committed a catastrophe. He apologized. This is worth noting, because apology in the deep sense, not the social gesture but the genuine taking of responsibility for having caused harm, is not a small thing, and it was not a thing that Rava had necessarily expected from a human being whom she had, until quite recently, regarded as a pest. One apologized, and he offered to help, and Rava, who had no other available allies in the world, and who was in any case bound to the physical place where she and Vaatu had fought, agreed to accept the offer. She would travel with him. She would remain bonded to him, which in her weakened state meant that she required his body in order to move through the world at all. And together, in whatever time they had before the harmonic convergence arrived, they would do what they could to prepare the world for what was coming. The journey they undertook from that point onward was a journey of 4 parts, because Rava understood, with a precision that one at first did not share, that the struggle ahead would require him to master not simply the fire he already possessed, but all 4 of the elements that the 4 lion turtles carried. They went to each lion turtle in turn, to the lion turtle of air, to the lion turtle of water, to the lion turtle of earth, and at each of them one petitioned for the bending of that element, and at each of them something in what he had become across the months of Ra'ava's companionship caused the lion turtle to grant the petition. He became the first human being to carry all 4 elements within a single body, and the bending of all 4, by the permanent and unprecedented gift of the 4 lion turtles, was his to keep. It is worth saying, because the later world would often forget it, that this was not an achievement of one's own making. It was given to him. The lion turtles had decided, in their long slow council across the shells of their distant cities, that the age of human beings living upon their backs was ending, and that a new arrangement was required, and that this particular human, who had stumbled into the breaking of the world and had responded to that breaking by choosing to help mend it, was the one through whom the new arrangement would be made. And so Wan, carrying Rava within him and all 4 elements in his hands, went out to face Vaatu at the coming of the harmonic convergence, and when the moment came, and the spirit portals at the north and south poles of the world opened, and the light and dark of the 2 great spirits came flooding through each other, Wan and Rava fused, not temporarily as they had been travelling, but permanently, in the precise and binding way that would shape every lifetime one would ever have after. The battle that followed was not quick. It was long and costly and fought across terrain that moved between the spirit world and the physical world, with a fluidity that made distinctions between them temporarily meaningless. And at the end of it, Wan and Rava together bound Vaatu into the tree of time at the centre of the spirit world, where he would be held for the next 10,000 years, until the following harmonic convergence should open, one again the possibility of his return. One closed the spirit portals at both poles. This was not entirely Rava's preference. She would have preferred, on philosophical grounds, to keep the 2 worlds overlapping as they had always been. But one, who had seen across the course of his long journey how much suffering the ordinary friction between human and spirit had caused, insisted. The portals were closed. The spirits retreated into their own realm. The physical world became, for the first time in its history, a place where human beings could walk without constantly negotiating for permission. And Wan, the first being in whom Rava and a human soul had been joined, took up the name that the bond between them deserved. He became, not by any council or any ceremony, simply by the new shape of what he now was, the Avatar. He lived a long life after that, and much of it was quiet. He wandered, as he had always wandered, though now he wandered with a purpose and with company, because Rava was always with him. And because the scattered human populations of the old lion turtle cities were descending from their shells for the first time, making their first uncertain settlements upon the ground that had so recently been too dangerous to inhabit. One moved among them. He helped. He mediated between human beings and the spirits who still, in isolated places, resented the new arrangement. He carried the 4 elements into every quarrel he could not otherwise resolve, and he tried, with mixed success, to model for the early settlements the kind of reverence for the world that he had learned in his years as an outcast. He was not, in most of these encounters, recognized as anything particularly special. He was an old man with a quiet manner who seemed to know more about how to calm a troubled spirit than most other humans did. The title of Avatar that he bore privately was not one that the early communities used. They called him by his name, and they accepted his help, and some of them loved him. And many of them did not particularly notice him at all. He died on a battlefield, which he had not wanted. The accounts of his last years suggest that even after the binding of Vaatu, the world was not peaceful in the way he had hoped it would be, that human beings, freed from the immediate dangers of the spirit wilds, had begun almost at once to discover the older and more familiar dangers of each other, and that one had spent much of his later life trying, usually unsuccessfully, to prevent the small wars that the newly descended human communities kept finding reasons to fight. He died trying to stop one of these wars. The battlefield itself is not named. What is remembered is that he was very old by then, and very tired, and that as his body was failing, Rava spoke to him with the voice she had first used in the forest clearing when he had released Vaatu by mistake. She told him that they would meet again. She told him that the bond between them would persist beyond the ending of his body, and that in every lifetime for as long as the world existed she would find him again, and they would do this work together, over and over, until the next harmonic convergence, and perhaps beyond it. She told him that he had done well, and Wan, who had begun his life as a thief and had ended it as the first avatar, heard this and accepted it, and closed his eyes, and the cycle that would carry his soul through every age of the world to come began, in the quiet of that unremembered battlefield, its first turning. The cycle that began in the quiet of that unremembered battlefield did not at first announce itself. There was no thunder at the moment of one's passing, no visible transfer of light from one body to another, no ceremony that the living world could witness or record. Rava, bonded to the soul that had carried her for the length of a human life, simply moved with that soul into whatever lies beyond the ending of a life, and waited, and when the next suitable vessel came into the world, an infant somewhere, in one of the small human settlements that were spreading outward from the feet of the old lion turtles, she rejoined that vessel, and a new avatar, knowing nothing yet of what she was, began the slow journey toward the recognition of what she had always been. This pattern, established in that first quiet moment of succession, would hold for the 10,000 years that lay ahead. It would shape the entire future history of the world, and for most of that history, the people living inside it would not fully understand what was shaping them. The element of the first avatar after one is not clearly recorded in the surviving texts. What is recorded, or at least strongly suggested by the fragments of lore that later generations were able to piece together, is the pattern that the succession eventually settled into, a rotation of fire, air, water, and earth, in that order, repeating itself across the centuries without variation. When a fire avatar died, the next avatar would be born into an air community. When that air avatar died, the next into water, then earth, then fire again, and the cycle would begin once more. The rotation was not a decision made by any council or any institution. It was simply the way Rava moved, the pattern of her reattachment to human souls, and it appears to have been, in some deep sense, a consequence of the original cosmological balance, the four elements needing in their turn to be the soul's home, so that no element should dominate the long arc of the avatar's lives, and no element should be neglected. The human communities that the avatars were born into during those earlier centuries after the closing of the spirit portals were still very small. The descent from the lion turtles had not happened all at once. Some of the old shell cities had come down quickly, their inhabitants spilling out onto the newly safe ground with the particular enthusiasm of people who had been waiting a long time for permission to live somewhere simpler. Others had descended more slowly, more carefully, establishing first a few tentative settlements on the immediate terrain near the lion turtle's resting place, and then, across generations, expanding outward as the safety of the new arrangement proved itself. The lion turtles themselves, having given up the bending they had carried for so long, had grown quiet, and had begun the slow withdrawal from the affairs of human beings that would eventually end with their passage into the deep waters and the remote caverns where, by the time of the Four Nations, they would be remembered only as legends. They did not die. They simply ceased across centuries to be visible, and the world they had so carefully protected continued without them. What the descended communities carried with them, down from their respective lion turtles, was their element. This is the seed from which the Four Nations would eventually grow, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Because the distinctiveness of the Four Nations as later ages would know them, the Fire Nation with its volcanic islands, the Water Tribes with their polar ice and their coastal inlets, the Earth Kingdom with its vast continental heartland, the Air Nomads with their mountain temples, was not the result of some arbitrary division of the world's peoples into 4 arbitrary groups. It was the slow, deep generational consequence of each community having come down from a particular lion turtle, carrying within itself the bending of that lion turtle's element, and then, over the course of many centuries, finding the landscape where that element felt most at home and settling into it. The fire communities gravitated toward warm places, toward volcanic islands where the ground itself carried something of the element they already knew. The water communities moved to the coasts and the poles where the element surrounded them. The earth communities spread across the great central continent. And the air communities, who required the thinnest and clearest skies for the particular contemplative practice their element seemed to invite, went to the mountains. The settlements themselves in those early centuries were small and scattered, and largely unaware of each other. A fire village on a southern island had no particular reason to know that. Somewhere on a northern peninsula, a water community was making its own arrangements with the tides. An air community in a high mountain pass had no reason to know that an earth community was building walls in a valley 1,000 miles to the south. The world was vast, and communication across its vastness was slow, and for a long time the 4 emerging cultures existed largely in parallel, each of them discovering, in its own way and at its own pace, what it meant to be a people bonded to a single element. The Avatar during these early centuries would occasionally move between them, carrying some knowledge from one community to another, but the Avatar's work in those early ages was less about the mediation of disputes between the 4 emerging nations. The nations were not yet large enough or close enough to dispute with each other very often, and more about the patient, generations-spanning task of helping each community understand its own element more deeply. Across the course of 2,000 or 3,000 years, the 4 communities grew into 4 civilizations, and the character of each civilization began to crystallize in ways that would persist for the rest of the world's history. It is worth taking the time to consider each of them in turn, because the depth of their differences is not always appreciated from inside the shorter histories that most later tellings of this world focus upon. These were not simply 4 groups of people who happened to bend 4 different elements. They were 4 entirely distinct ways of being human, each of them shaped across millennia by its particular elemental inheritance. The Air Nomads, as they came to call themselves, were the smallest of the 4 civilizations, and also in some ways the most peculiar. Their ancestors had come down from the lion turtle of air, and the thinness of the upper altitudes had remained, for the whole of their subsequent history, their preferred element. They built their temples at the tops of mountains so remote and so high that reaching them required either extraordinary climbing or the assistance of the flying bison that had allied with them in the early centuries and had become, over time, something like partners in the nomadic life. They did not build cities in the conventional sense. They did not, in the main, farm. They did not accumulate wealth, because the particular philosophy that the element of air had taught them was a philosophy of non-attachment, and accumulation was the opposite of that philosophy. They lived instead in the 4 great temples that their ancestors had built in the first centuries after the descent, and they moved between those temples according to the seasons and the particular spiritual rhythms of their practice, and they gave their lives to meditation and to the cultivation of a particular quality of attention that was considered within their tradition to be the fullest expression of what human beings could become. Their airbending in the deepest sense was not a weapon or a tool. It was an expression of the non-attached awareness that they were trying to cultivate, a release rather than a grasping. The water tribes took a different shape. They had in the early centuries divided into 2 large branches, a northern tribe that settled at the far northern pole of the world, and a southern tribe that settled at the far southern pole, with a smaller and more dispersed population of waterbenders scattered among the coastal communities and the swamps and the river valleys in between. The water tribes built with ice and with whalebone, and with the careful conservation of the few resources that the polar regions afforded them. Their philosophy, shaped by the element they carried, was a philosophy of reciprocity, the understanding that water gave and water took, that the tides rose and the tides fell, that a life lived well was a life lived in the rhythm of exchange rather than in the illusion of accumulation. They hunted seals and whales and fish, and they did so with a particular discipline of gratitude that their religious traditions had codified across generations. They built their great ice cities at the poles, and they maintained in those cities a kind of civilization that the warmer nations, when they eventually learned of it, found it difficult to credit. A civilization of fluidity and patience, adapted to the harshest climates on Earth, that had managed to become not simply survivable but beautiful. The Earth Kingdom became, by the measure of sheer population and territory, the largest of the four nations. The lion turtle of Earth had carried the largest of the early human cities, and the descendants of that city had spread outward across the great central continent of the world, establishing settlements, and then towns, and then kingdoms, and eventually a loose political structure of many kingdoms within the single overarching identity of being Earth Kingdom people. Their philosophy, shaped by their element, was a philosophy of endurance. Stone did not move easily. Stone outlasted the things that tried to break it. Stone remembered. The Earth Kingdom built walls, and they built them to last. The walls of Omashu, the walls of Ba Sing Se, the countless smaller walls of countless smaller towns. And the act of walling was, for the Earth Kingdom culture, not simply a defensive measure, but a kind of civilizational statement, an assertion that what was worth keeping was worth defending, and that what was worth defending should be defended patiently, across generations, by the slow, deep accumulation of stone against the forces that would otherwise dissolve it. The Fire Nation, finally, was shaped by its own particular logic, which was the logic of forward motion. Fire does not stand still. Fire moves, and the communities that descended from the lion turtle of fire carried within themselves a restless forward-pressing quality that distinguished them from the other three nations. They settled the volcanic islands to the west and southwest of the central continent, and the geography of those islands, which required them to live with a certain intensity in order to live at all, encouraged in them the habits of ambition and improvement and collective effort that would, in a much later age, curdle into something much more troubling. In its original form, before the corruptions of the later ages, the Fire Nation was a civilization of makers and of artists and of people who loved the world with a particular passionate attention. They invented things. They developed crafts and philosophies and forms of music that the other three nations had not thought of. Their fire-bending in the age before it was weaponized was a bending of warmth and of light, the warmth of a hearth, the light of a lantern, the particular illumination that the dragons who had taught them the art had understood as the original gift of the element. And across these four slowly elaborating civilizations the Avatar continued to walk. The names of the Avatars who lived during these early centuries are, for the most part, not preserved in the surviving texts. There must have been hundreds of them across the first several thousand years of the cycle, each living a life of anywhere between 50 and 100 years, each passing on to the next, each doing whatever the particular demands of the age had required. Most of them, we may safely assume, lived quiet lives. The ordinary work of an Avatar, in an age of four small and mostly peaceable nations that did not yet have much cause to quarrel with each other, was not the dramatic intervention that later ages would associate with the role. It was rather the patient stewardship of whatever small troubles arose in the particular community where the Avatar had been born, and the occasional longer journey to learn the other three elements from whichever masters in whichever other nations had been identified as the best available teachers. The training itself became, over time, more formal. In the earlier centuries, an Avatar's learning of the four elements was an improvisational affair, worked out between the Avatar and whatever teachers could be found. But as the centuries accumulated, each of the four nations developed institutional traditions for the training of its own Avatars, and these traditions, by the middle of the Avatar cycle's long history, had become something like a shared cultural infrastructure that stretched across the four nations and connected them in ways that little else did. When the Avatar was born into the Fire Nation, the northern and southern water tribes knew that, in a certain number of years, a young fire-born Avatar would eventually travel to them to learn waterbending, and they prepared their best teachers accordingly. When the Avatar was born into the water tribes, the Earth Kingdom and the Air Nomads made similar preparations. This shared infrastructure, unspectacular as it was, represented a kind of civilizational achievement that the four nations did not always appreciate, a working arrangement maintained across thousands of years, by which the four peoples of the world agreed that the Avatar belonged to all of them, and that the training of the Avatar was a collective responsibility that transcended whatever smaller differences might otherwise have divided them. And the Avatars themselves, moving through this infrastructure across their many lifetimes, became, in their quiet way, the living thread that held the four nations together. They were never the rulers of any nation. They did not lead armies. They did not, in most cases, accumulate wealth or power in any worldly sense. What they did, across the long centuries of the cycle, was simply exist, as reminders, walking among the four peoples, that the four peoples were, at the deepest level, one people, divided for the purposes of living well with their elements, but united in the shared cosmological fact that a single soul, turning through the generations, belonged equally to all of them. Most people, in most ages, did not fully appreciate this. They took the Avatar for granted, the way people take for granted any arrangement that has been in place for longer than their own memory. They did not often reflect on how young this arrangement actually was in the deeper history of the world, or on how much of their world's relative peace depended on the quiet turning of the cycle that one had, so long ago, initiated with the best and most unwise of intentions. And the cycle turned. The names and the faces of the avatars changed. The four nations grew and changed, and occasionally quarrelled, and occasionally reconciled, and moved through the long, slow seasons of their own histories. But underneath everything, the pattern held: fire, air, water, earth, in their turn, across the centuries. The wheel of the elements turned, and the single soul turned with it, and the world, for the most part, remained a world that one would have recognised, had he been able to look forward from that long-ago battlefield and see what his small decisions in the forest clearing had, over 10,000 years, made possible. The pattern held, fire and air and water and earth turning in their long unhurried rotation, and the world beneath that turning continued in the particular quiet way that worlds continue when nothing very dramatic is happening to them. But of the four civilizations that had grown up from the feet of the four lion turtles, one in particular deserves to be looked at closely, because its character and its fate would shape everything that came after, and because the loss of it, when the loss eventually came, would be felt across the whole of the later history of the world as a wound that never entirely healed. The Air Nomads were the smallest of the four nations, as we have said, and also the most peculiar, and also, in the judgment of those later scholars who bothered to think carefully about such things, the most nearly finished, the most fully realised, the furthest along in the long civilizational work of becoming what their element had, across thousands of years, been gently teaching them to become. They lived in 4 temples, and the geography of those temples was itself a kind of meditation. The Northern Air Temple sat upon the peaks of a range that ran through the upper reaches of the Earth Kingdom, at an altitude so high that the air was thin enough to require, for those not accustomed to it, a period of adjustment before one could walk through its corridors without growing dizzy. The Southern Air Temple stood on a mountain in the Patola mountain range to the southwest of the main continent, a temple of the most ancient stonework, the first of the 4 to have been built. The Eastern Air Temple was perched on a chain of floating mountains in a region of unusual wind patterns, where the stone pillars rose out of a sea of clouds that moved in slow, deliberate currents around them. And the Western Air Temple was the strangest of all, hanging beneath the lip of a great cliff rather than above it, the building suspended downward into the open air so that those who lived there walked on floors that faced, upside down, the empty sky below. Each of the temples had been built in the particular location it occupied because something about that location had seemed, to the air nomads of a very early age, to express something true about the nature of air itself. The thinness of the northern peaks, the ancient settledness of the south, the floating impermanence of the east, the inverted strangeness of the west. Together the 4 temples formed a kind of elemental prayer, written across the geography of the world in the language of stone and wind. The air nomads who lived in those temples did not number a great many by the reckoning of the larger nations. There were perhaps 10,000 of them at the height of their civilization, scattered across the 4 temples, which meant that any given temple might have held something in the range of 2,000 or 3,000 monks and nuns at a time. This was a small population by any standard, and yet the smallness was not a limitation they had struggled against. It was rather a condition they had come to prefer. They believed with the deep and patient conviction that 10,000 years of reflection on the matter had given them that a civilization's worth was not measured by its population or its wealth, or the extent of its territorial holdings, but by the quality of attention it could cultivate in its individual members, and that a small population of deeply attentive people was worth, in the scale that mattered, a great deal more than a large population of inattentive ones. This belief shaped every aspect of their culture. The philosophy of non-attachment was the spine of Air Nomad life, and it is worth sitting with for a moment because the term can be easily misunderstood. Non-attachment in the Air Nomad tradition was not coldness. It was not the absence of love, or the refusal of connection, or the cultivation of indifference toward the world and its inhabitants. It was rather the understanding that all things are temporary, that every relationship and every possession and every moment will eventually pass, and that the appropriate response to this truth is not to grip one's experiences tightly in the hope of preventing their passage, a gripping that only causes pain and cannot in any case succeed, but to hold them loosely with full attention and full warmth and full openness, and to release them cleanly when their time has come. An air nomad could love another person as deeply as anyone else in the world loved anyone. The difference was that the air nomad did not confuse the love with the demand that the beloved remain unchanged, or remain present, or remain the property of the one who loved them. The love itself was considered more important than the circumstances under which it was expressed, and the willingness to let the circumstances change without the love being diminished was considered, within the tradition, one of the highest forms of spiritual achievement. This philosophy expressed itself in 100 small ways throughout the daily life of the temples. The air nomads did not accumulate possessions. A monk or nun of the order would typically own no more than a few simple garments, a staff for gliding, a begging bowl, perhaps a small collection of scrolls or musical instruments for personal study, and nothing else. They did not eat meat, because the taking of life was considered a violation of the respect owed to the interconnectedness of all beings. They did not marry in the ordinary sense, though they formed deep and often lifelong friendships, and in some cases romantic partnerships that operated within the larger framework of monastic community. They did not engage in commerce beyond the bare minimum required for their contact with the other nations. They did not fight wars. They did not, as a general matter, fight at all, because fighting presupposed an attachment to outcomes that the tradition considered spiritually corrosive. And yet, for all this apparent quietness, the air nomads were not passive or withdrawn in the way that an outside observer might have assumed. They travelled, and they travelled widely. The very name they had given themselves, nomads, reflected a central element of their practice. An air nomad did not remain fixed in one place, even within the limited geography of the 4 temples. The monks and nuns of the order moved continuously between the temples and between the temples and the wider world, carrying with them whatever small knowledge or service they could offer to the communities they passed through, accepting with gratitude whatever hospitality was extended to them, and departing again when the time to depart had arrived. They were, in every village of the other 3 nations, occasional visitors rather than permanent residents, and they were known, across the centuries, for a particular quality of presence that people who had encountered them tended to remember afterward, a lightness, a warmth, a quality of attention that did not grasp at anything, and did not require anything from the people it was offered to. The flying bison deserved their own consideration, because the bond between the air nomads and these beasts was one of the defining features of the civilization. The bison were enormous, gentle, 6-legged herbivores with thick fur and long, broad tails, and the capacity for flight that came, like all such capacities in this world, from an early relationship with the element of air. They were not bred to the nomads in the way that horses or dogs might be bred to other cultures. They were rather partners, beings who had chosen, across the early centuries, to live alongside the airbending human beings who had seemed to them to share something essential of their own nature. The nomads called them friends, not animals, and a young air nomad would typically bond with a particular flying bison at an early age, and the bond would last in most cases for the whole of both their lives. The bison carried the nomads between the temples. They carried them on long journeys across the wider world. They shared the nomads' vegetarian diet, and they were beloved of the nomads with a tenderness that the other 3 nations, who rarely formed such bonds with their own beasts of burden, found difficult to fully appreciate. The practice of airbending itself, within the temples, was not what it would have been in a more militarized tradition. There was no combat training in the air nomad curriculum, or rather, there was no combat training beyond the minimum required for the graceful self-defense that the tradition considered sometimes necessary but never sought. The airbending that the nomads developed was oriented instead toward meditation, toward flight, toward the cultivation of a particular quality of bodily lightness that reflected the spiritual lightness they were trying to achieve internally. The gliders they carried, the staves that opened at the touch of a bending hand. Into wings that caught the air, there were not weapons. They were extensions of the practice. An air nomad with a glider was not armed. An air nomad with a glider was, in a certain sense, more completely themselves than an air nomad without one, because the glider permitted the practitioner to move through the world with the same freedom that the inner practice aspired to. The blue arrow tattoos that marked the bodies of the master airbenders were given in ceremony after years of training when a young airbender had achieved full mastery of the 36 traditional techniques of the art. The arrow that ran down the forehead and over the top of the shaved scalp, the arrows that ran down the arms to the backs of the hands, the arrows that ran down the legs to the tops of the feet. These were the visible signs of a long internal journey, and they were received with the particular solemnity that the nomads brought to all their ceremonies. The tattoos identified their bearers as masters, and they were rare. Most air nomads never received them, because most air nomads had not achieved the specific level of practice the tattoos required, and this was considered perfectly acceptable. The tradition did not demand mastery from everyone. It demanded only honesty and patience, and the willingness to continue the practice across whatever lifetime one had been given. Among the air nomads, as among all 4 nations, the avatar was born in the appropriate turn of the cycle, and when the avatar was an air nomad, the training of that particular child took on a character that the other 3 nations could not have provided. The child would be identified in the usual way, by the traditional test involving 4 toys drawn from among a larger assortment, with the 4 particular toys being the ones that had belonged to previous avatars, and the child being expected to choose those 4 without prompting. And upon identification, the child would begin the same long curriculum of meditation and practice that all young air nomads pursued, with the additional knowledge, held carefully by the monks responsible for the child's guidance, that this particular student would eventually be required to learn the other 3 elements as well, and to carry the weight of the avatar's work across whatever age was coming. It is worth saying, because later ages would sometimes forget it, that the air nomads in their long history had produced a great many avatars, and the air nomad avatars had been, as a general matter, among the most beloved of all the avatars the world had known. The particular combination of spiritual training and philosophical depth that the air nomad tradition cultivated tended to produce avatars of unusual wisdom. And the small number of air nomad avatars whose names were well remembered in the larger historical tradition, Yang Qin above all, who had lived 2 or 3 lifetimes before the avatar of Roku, were remembered precisely for the quality of reconciliation they had been able to bring to the disputes of the other 3 nations. An air nomad avatar, the tradition held, was particularly well suited to the work of mediation, because the practice of non-attachment gave such an avatar a useful distance from the passions that typically fueled conflicts, and the same practice gave such an avatar a particular warmth of presence that made the parties to a conflict more willing to listen to counsel. All of this, the temples, the tradition, the flying bison, the 10,000 years of accumulated practice, was the world the air nomads had built for themselves across the long patient centuries, and it was, by the standards of any honest reckoning, a remarkable achievement. It was also, by the time we reached the period just before the story that most people know, beginning to exist under a quality of light that the nomads themselves did not quite recognize. There was a sense, felt by very few, and those few were mostly young, that something in the wider world was changing, and that the change had to do with the Fire Nation, and that the air nomads, in their tranquil and untroubled way, were not preparing for whatever was coming. The elders of the temples, when pressed on this, would tend to reply with the traditional wisdom, that attachment to the future was as corrosive as attachment to the past, that the present moment was all that any of them truly possessed, that whatever came would come and would be met when it arrived. This wisdom was not wrong. It was, in fact, one of the most deeply considered pieces of wisdom that tradition had produced across its long history. But it was also, in a way the elders did not fully see, inadequate to the particular shape of the darkness that was, at that very moment, beginning to gather on the volcanic islands far to the west, a darkness that would not announce itself before it struck, and that would not be met when it arrived by anything that the nomads in their long tradition of peace had prepared themselves to meet. and so the temples continued in their patient rhythm, the monks and nuns moving between them, the bison gliding through the high, thin air of the mountain peaks, the young students learning the 36 techniques and receiving in their time the blue arrows that would mark them as masters. The air carried, as it always had, the scent of incense from the temple meditation halls and the sound of the bells that mark the hours of the day. And somewhere in the small, quiet life of one of the temples, a young boy was being raised in the usual way, a boy who would, in his own time, be identified as the next Avatar, and who would carry within him, though he did not yet know it, the last living memory of what the Air Nomad civilization had been. His name was Aang. But before his story can be told, we must follow the thread back to the Fire Nation, and to the two boys who grew up together there, and whose friendship in breaking would break the world. The thread that leads back to the Fire Nation begins in a place that, in the long, slow beginnings of that civilization, had been one of the gentlest parts of the world. The volcanic islands to the west of the main continent had been, for most of the Fire Nation's history, a land of warm beaches and ferns that grew in the rich black soil around the flanks of the dormant volcanoes, of small villages tucked into sheltered valleys where the smoke from the cooking fires rose straight up into skies that were, for most of the year, an almost impossibly clear blue. The Fire Nation of the older centuries had loved the world in the particular way that firebenders loved things, with attention, with passion, with the warmth that was their element's best expression. And the civilization they had built across the islands had been a civilization of artists and scholars and careful craftspeople. The people who made the silk screens and the lacquered wood and the particular forms of music that only a people attuned to the delicate modulations of heat and flame could have invented. It was into this civilization that Avatar Roku was born, in a year that would later be reckoned as approximately 82 years before the end of the 100-Year War, on one of the smaller of the Fire Nation islands. His parents were not notable people. They were not of the royal line, not of the old aristocracy, not of the network of powerful families that had gathered around the capital across the preceding centuries. They were simply Fire Nation citizens of modest standing, and they raised their son in the ordinary way that Fire Nation children were raised, with warmth, with discipline, with the expectation that he would, in his own time, find some honourable place in the gentle and creative society around him. Roku did not know in those early years that he was the Avatar. The tradition held that the identification of the Avatar occurred at the age of 16, and the reasons for this were ancient and deliberate, and they had to do with protecting the child from the enormous weight of the identification until the child was old enough to begin to bear it. And so Roku grew up, in the particular way that Fire children grew up, and across the particular geography that shaped all Fire Nation children: the black sand beaches, the warm volcanic pools, the shaded groves of broad-leaved trees, and he was, by all the surviving accounts, a boy of no particular distinction. He was not the brightest student in his cohort. He was not the best athlete. He was not the most favoured. What he was, however, was the close and devoted friend of another boy, a boy born within a single day of him on the same small island, a boy whose family did happen to belong to the old nobility, and whose name was Sozin. The proximity of their birth dates was the sort of small coincidence that island communities noticed and remarked upon, and the two boys, introduced to each other as infants by families who found the shared birth time auspicious, grew up as brothers in everything but blood. They learned to walk together. They learned to read together. They learned, in the early stages, the basics of firebending together, because both of them had shown, from a young age, the particular aptitude that the tradition recognized, and between them there developed, across the years of their childhood, a bond of the kind that the island culture of the Fire Nation had always understood as one of the most precious things a person could possess. A bond of chosen kinship, of the sort that would, in the ordinary course of things, have lasted the full length of both their lives. Sozin was the crown prince. His family was the royal family, and his father was the reigning Fire Lord, and Sozin had been raised from birth with the expectation that he would, in his own time, take up the throne and continue the line. But this had not, in the years of their childhood, made any particular difference to the friendship between the two boys. Sozin came and went from the royal palace as a child of the palace came and went, with attendants, with obligations, with the particular kind of formal training that a crown prince required. But whenever his obligations permitted, he would return to the island and to Roku, and the two of them would disappear into the quiet corners of their shared childhood, swimming in the warm pools and practicing their fire-bending forms together on the beaches in the late afternoons, and sharing with each other the small confidences that boys of a certain age share with the one person they trust above all others. Roku, for his part, felt no particular envy of Sozin's station. He was, by temperament, a boy who did not much care for ceremony, and the royal life that Sozin would eventually be required to take up seemed, to Roku's honest and uncomplicated eyes, more burden than privilege. The turning came in their 16th year. This is the age at which the Fire Nation, following the traditions shared among all 4 nations, would have observed the ceremonial recognition of adulthood, and it was also the age at which the monks charged with identifying the Avatar would typically arrive to make their presentation to the child who had, in earlier infancy, passed the traditional 4-toy test. Roku had passed the test as an infant without his parents ever being told. The monks had identified him, and had then, in keeping with the long-established protocols of secrecy, kept the knowledge to themselves, and had waited. And on the morning of Roku's 16th birthday, the monks came to the small house on the island where he lived with his parents. And they told him who he was, and his life turned in a way that he had not expected and was not, at first, entirely sure he wanted. He told Sozin that same afternoon. The texts do not preserve the exact words that passed between them, but they record that Roku went immediately to find his friend, that he told him the news with the same directness that had always characterized their conversation, and that Sozin received the news with what all the surviving accounts describe as genuine joy, the uncomplicated happiness of a young man discovering that his closest friend had turned out to be something even more remarkable than either of them had previously known. Sozin embraced him. Sozin congratulated him. Sozin offered with the openness of a 16-year-old who had not yet learned to calculate the political implications of anything, whatever resources of the royal house might be useful to Roku in the long training that lay ahead. The friendship at that moment was as strong as it had ever been, and perhaps stronger, and neither of them had any sense at all that this was the last time in their lives when it would be so. Roku began his training. The curriculum of the Avatar was the same for him as for every Avatar before him, adjusted only for the particular circumstances of the Fire Nation and the particular talents that he himself had shown. He continued his firebending studies with the masters of the Fire Nation tradition, and in his 20th year he began the long journey that took him first to the air temples to learn the bending of his second element, and then to the water tribes, and then to the Earth Kingdom. Each of these journeys occupied him for several years, and each of them deepened him in ways that the quiet islands of his childhood had not prepared him for. He learned airbending from the monks of the Southern Air Temple, and the practice of non-attachment which they cultivated was something that the firebender in him found genuinely difficult, but which he came, in time, to appreciate as a corrective to certain natural impulses of the element he had been born to. He learned waterbending from the Northern Water Tribe, whose disciplined and traditional approach suited his temperament, and he learned earthbending from a master in the Earth Kingdom whose name has been preserved in a handful of texts as Sud. By the time he returned to the Fire Nation, he was close to 30 years old, and he had become, in the quiet and unflashy way that most avatars became such things, a fully realized master of all 4 elements and a man of some considerable depth. Sozin, in the meantime, had become Fire Lord. His father had died while Roku was still in the Earth Kingdom, and Sozin had taken up the throne in the appropriate ceremonies, and when Roku returned to the Fire Nation capital after his long training, it was not as a friend visiting a friend, but as the Avatar visiting the monarch of his home nation. The 2 men met with genuine warmth. They embraced, as they had embraced 1,000 times in the years of their boyhood. They sat together and shared tea and told each other the accumulated stories of the years they had been apart. And for a period that the texts suggest was several years, perhaps as many as 10, the friendship persisted in something close to its old form, with Sozin occasionally consulting Roku on matters of state, and Roku, for his part, making his home not in any single location but, as avatars often did, moving between the nations as the work required him. The first shadow fell at Sozin's coronation, or rather at the private conversation that followed it. Sozin, newly crowned and full of the optimism that belonged to a young Fire Lord at the beginning of his reign, took Roku aside in the gardens behind the palace and proposed to him an idea that he had, he said, been thinking about for some time. The Fire Nation, Sozin said, had become in the centuries of its prosperity the most advanced of the 4 nations. It had developed sciences and arts and systems of organization that the other nations had not yet achieved. It had accumulated, through its industriousness and its particular elemental temperament, a kind of civilizational wealth that it would be, Sozin argued, almost selfish to keep entirely to itself. Why should the Fire Nation not share its advances with the other three nations? Why should the people of the Earth Kingdom not benefit from Fire Nation engineering, the people of the Water Tribes from Fire Nation medicine, the Air Nomads from whatever of Fire Nation culture they might find useful? The proposal, as Sozin presented it, was not a proposal of conquest. It was, he insisted, a proposal of generosity. An age, as he described it, of shared greatness. Roku said no. The conversation that followed has been partially preserved, and it is one of the quietest and most important conversations in the deep political history of this world. Roku, speaking gently, as one friend to another, told Sozin that what he was proposing would not, whatever its intentions, end as generosity. It would end, Roku said, as imposition. An imposition by one nation upon another was a violation of the balance that it was his particular responsibility to preserve. The four nations existed as four, not as one, and the integrity of each of them depended upon the others respecting the boundaries between them. Sozin, Roku said, must abandon this idea and must never return to it. Sozin, at that moment, appeared to accept the counsel. He did not argue, he did not press. He simply nodded and changed the subject, and the two friends parted in the evening with what seemed, on the surface, to be the same warmth that had always characterized their relations. But something had changed. Neither man spoke of it. The friendship continued outwardly for years after this conversation, with visits and letters and the maintenance of the old forms of affection. Yet within the interior of the friendship a small and very patient crack had opened, and it did not close. Sozin, Roku would later come to understand, had not abandoned the idea. He had only, in the wake of the conversation, concluded that Roku was not someone he could share the idea with, and that the project he had in mind would have to be pursued, if it was to be pursued at all, without the Avatar's knowledge or consent. Roku learned of this eventually, many years later, when evidence of Fire Nation military activity in the Earth Kingdom's peripheral territories came to his attention through channels the Fire Lord had not known existed. He went to Sozin. He confronted him. The confrontation, this time, was not gentle. The two old friends, now grown men of middle age, argued in the throne room of the Fire Lord's palace with a bitterness that neither of them had ever used against the other before, and at the end of the argument Roku defeated Sozin in direct combat, not killing him, though the texts are clear that he could have, but disarming him and declaring with the full authority of the Avatar that any further movement toward expansion would be met with force. Roku departed the palace that night. He returned to his home on his volcanic island, and he resolved to watch, across whatever years remained to him, whether Sozin would heed the warning or would, as Roku feared, simply wait for him to die. Roku died first. This is the tragedy that shapes everything that followed, and it shapes it in a way that the texts, when they allow themselves to grieve without restraint. The volcano on Roku's home island, which had been dormant for as long as anyone could remember, erupted in his 70th year. Roku, who had been aging but was still in full possession of his powers, attempted to calm the eruption using the combined bending of all four elements, and for a time he was succeeding. He sent word to Sozin. The Fire Lord arrived on his dragon, and for a brief moment it appeared that the two old friends, despite everything that had passed between them, might work together one last time to save the island. But as Roku grew exhausted from the sustained bending, as the toxic fumes from the volcano began to overcome him, Sozin made a calculation. He looked at his weakened friend. He looked at the Avatar whose continued existence stood between him and the empire he had never abandoned the dream of building. And he turned his dragon, and he flew away, and he left Roku to die. Roku died there, alone on the black slopes of his home island. As the volcano consumed the small communities he had known since his boyhood, Fang, his own dragon, attempted to save him and died with him. And somewhere, in that same moment, across the wide ocean in the Southern Air Temple, a child was being conceived who would, in his own time, be identified as the next Avatar, a boy who would eventually be named Aang, and who would, across the long silence that followed Roku's death, carry within his soul the memory of everything that had just been lost in the slow, terrible awareness of what Sozin, freed now from the one man who might have restrained him, was about to do to the world. The child who had been conceived in the Southern Air Temple in the very moment of Roku's death grew, in the ordinary way that Air Nomad children grew, across the years that Sozin used to prepare. This is the terrible parallel that the later scholars of this age would come to dwell upon, and it is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shapes the particular shape of the tragedy that is about to unfold. While the boy who would become Aang learned to crawl and to walk and to speak and to form his first careful words, while the monks of the Southern Air Temple identified him as the Avatar and began, with the quiet attention they brought to all their sacred responsibilities, the long work of his raising, the Fire Lord on the other side of the world was spending those same years doing something very different. Sozin was building, he was preparing, he was assembling the military and industrial machinery that his old friend's death had finally permitted him to assemble, and he was waiting. With a patience that was entirely unlike the patience of the Air Nomads, for the particular celestial alignment that would make everything he had been preparing for possible at last. The comet came once every 100 years. This is a fact that the astronomers of the Fire Nation had known for a long time, and that the scholars of the other three nations had known as well, though with less attention to its implications. The comet was a small and unassuming object, visible from the surface of the world only briefly during the few days of its closest approach, and its passage was ordinarily regarded as a curiosity rather than as an event of any great consequence. But the comet carried with it, by mechanisms that the natural philosophy of the time only partially understood, an amplification of the particular cosmic energy that firebenders drew upon for their art. During the passage of the comet, the power of firebending was magnified to a degree that made ordinary firebenders into something close to what great firebenders would otherwise be, and made great firebenders into something close to what only the greatest of the ancient masters had been. The comet had passed overhead during the reign of Sozin's grandfather, and during the reign of his grandfather's grandfather, and at each of its passings the Fire Nation had observed the event with the particular quiet satisfaction that belonged to a people whose element had, for a few bright days, been briefly exalted. Its coming had not, in any of these earlier passings, been the occasion of any particular historical event. Sozin intended that this time would be different. He had calculated, with the precision of a man who had been thinking about very little else for decades, the exact date on which the comet would next appear, and he had organised the full force of his military preparations around that date. The comet would arrive in the year that would later be reckoned as the first year of the 100-Year War, and it would give him, during the few days of its passage, a window of fire-bending power that no army in the world would be capable of resisting. He knew this. His generals knew this. The full resources of the Fire Nation had been poured, across the years since Roku's death, into the preparation for what Sozin understood would be a brief and decisive application of that power against the one target whose destruction was the prerequisite for everything else he intended to do. The target was the Air Nomads. This is the particular detail of Sozin's calculation that has made the later scholars of this age most bitter, and it is worth sitting with the logic of it for a moment, because the logic was not the logic of a madman. It was the logic of a patient and intelligent and thoroughly corrupted ruler who had thought the matter through with great care. The next avatar, Sozin knew, would be an Air Nomad. He had no way of knowing exactly which Air Nomad. The identification of the avatar was held secret by the monks, and the Fire Nation's intelligence on the internal affairs of the air temples was imperfect. But he knew that somewhere in the four temples, in the general age cohort of children who had been born in the years immediately following Roku's death, the next avatar was being raised, and he knew, with the clarity of a man who had once been the closest friend of an avatar, exactly how much trouble an avatar could make for his plans. The solution, as Sozin had come to understand it, was to remove the avatar before the avatar was old enough to become a full threat. And the simplest way to remove an avatar whose specific identity he did not know was to remove the entire population from which the avatar had been drawn. The decision to commit genocide was not, in the surviving accounts, presented to Sozin's inner circle with any particular drama. The Fire Lord laid out the strategic rationale. The generals accepted it. The plans were made. And when the comet arrived, the Fire Nation military, in a single coordinated operation that had been rehearsed in its specific details for years, descended upon the four air temples simultaneously. They came by air, on great fleets of the sky bisons the Fire Nation had captured and domesticated for this purpose, and on the early forms of the airships that Fire Nation engineers had begun to develop. They came with the power of the comet blazing in their bending, and they came with orders that were clear and specific and admitted of no exceptions. What happened in the temples on the day of Sozin's comet is not something that the texts describe in detail, and the lack of detail is itself a kind of mourning. The Air Nomads were not warriors. They had no standing army, no fortifications worthy of the name, no strategic reserves, no protocols for defence against an invasion of any scale. Their philosophy had, for 10,000 years, been the philosophy of peace, and their practice of that philosophy had been so complete that when the moment came for them to require the opposite of what their practice had cultivated, they could not. The monks and nuns of the temples met the attack with the tools their tradition had given them, with wind, with evasion, with the quiet attempts at de-escalation that had worked in the much smaller conflicts their scattered travellers had occasionally encountered across the centuries. Against an opponent who had come with the explicit intention of killing everyone present, the tools were not sufficient. The elders died first, because they did not run. Many of them, by all the accounts that could later be pieced together, sat down in the great meditation halls of their temples when they understood what was happening, and waited. They did not flee because flight would have required them to leave behind the younger monks and nuns who would not have been able to keep pace, and they had long ago made the internal peace required to face such a moment without panic. The younger monks, some of them, did attempt to flee. A few of them, by various small miracles of circumstance, actually succeeded, and their accounts, gathered many years later by the chroniclers of other nations, are the source of most of what we know about the details of what happened in the temples, but the number who escaped was very small. The great majority of the air nomad population died in the temples on that single day, or in the valleys and the mountain paths immediately below the temples as they attempted the descent, and by the time the comet had finished its passage, and the firebenders who had conducted the killings had returned to their ships, the air nomad civilization that had existed for 10,000 years no longer existed at all. The flying bison were hunted separately, in a campaign that extended over the weeks and months following the initial attack. The Fire Nation military understood that the bison would otherwise carry surviving nomads to safety, and they understood also that the bison themselves represented a symbol that the Fire Nation preferred not to have surviving in the world. The hunts were thorough. By the end of them, the population of flying bison, which had numbered perhaps several thousand before the war began, was reduced to a number that could be counted on the fingers of a single hand. The nomads' gliders were broken. The temples themselves were not destroyed, because the Fire Nation saw no particular reason to destroy them, and in the aftermath of the killings the 4 temples simply sat empty on their mountains, and their floating pillars and their inverted cliffs, the wind moving through them as it had always moved, the stone unchanged, the libraries intact, the meditation halls preserved in precisely the arrangement the nomads had left them in when they sat down to die. And somewhere in the midst of all of this, on the morning the comet arrived, the boy who had been Aang was not in any of the temples. This is the particular small mercy that the world would later have cause to be grateful for, and it is also the particular small cruelty that Aang himself, when he eventually understood what had happened, would have cause to grieve for as long as he lived. He had been told, in the months before the comet's arrival, that the monks had identified him as the Avatar. He had been told this earlier than the tradition normally permitted, because the monks had been worried about the rising tensions with the Fire Nation, and had wanted him to begin his broader training sooner than the ordinary schedule would have allowed. And he had been told, more recently, that he was to be separated from his beloved teacher Gyatso, and sent to the Eastern Air Temple for training under masters who would, the high monks believed, be better suited to preparing him for the crisis that was coming. Aang had not wanted this. Aang, who was 12 years old, had loved Gyatso with the full, simple love that a child has for the adult who has raised him, and the prospect of being taken away from Gyatso had been, to Aang's 12-year-old heart, unbearable. He had run away. This is what he had done, with the uncomplicated directness of a frightened child, on the night before the separation was to take place. He had taken his flying bison, a young beast named Appa, who had been bonded to him since his own infancy, and he had flown out of the Southern Air Temple into a storm that had been gathering over the ocean, and he had attempted to reach nowhere in particular, because 12-year-old boys who are running from grief do not typically have destinations. The storm had caught them. Appa had gone into the water, and Aang had gone into the water with him, and in the moment of greatest danger, as the two of them sank beneath the cold waves of the ocean the Avatar state had activated, and Aang, without any conscious decision on his part, had frozen the water around them into a sphere of ice that preserved both of them exactly as they were in the moment of its formation. The sphere had sunk. It had come to rest on the ocean floor somewhere in the polar waters of the far south, and the boy who was the last air nomad in the world, and the bison who was one of the last of his species, were preserved in their ice, alive but unconscious, held outside of time by the Avatar state's deep and entirely involuntary act of self-preservation, while the comet passed overhead and the temples emptied and the civilization that had raised him ended without his knowledge in a single day. The world that woke the next morning was not the world that had gone to sleep the night before. The Fire Nation, for its part, did not celebrate what it had done. The text suggests that even within Sozin's court, the scale of what had been accomplished was not discussed openly, and that the official histories of the period preferred to describe the events of the comet's passage in vague and evasive language that would not require future generations to confront the specifics. In the other three nations, the news travelled slowly, because the Air Nomads had always been a dispersed and quiet presence in the world, and the absence of a people who had never been especially visible did not register at first as the catastrophe it was. Over the following months and years, as traders and travellers and the occasional diplomatic mission reported back to their home nations that the temples were empty and that no air nomads could be found anywhere, the truth assembled itself gradually in the minds of those who were paying attention. By the time the Earth Kingdom and the Water Tribes had fully understood what had happened, the Fire Nation was already moving on to the next phase of Sozin's plans, and the opportunity to respond to the genocide with any meaningful action had, by the ordinary logic of international affairs, passed, and the silence that settled over the four temples, the four beautiful and ancient temples, still standing in their geographies of meditation, with the wind moving through their empty corridors and the meditation halls preserved in their final arrangements, became, across the years that followed, one of the deepest silences in the history of this world. It was the silence of something that the world had not known how to name until it was gone, and then, with the elements still turning in its slow cosmic rotation, and the next airborne avatar presumably due to arrive in the ordinary turn of the cycle and yet not arriving, could not quite find the resources to properly grieve. The air nomads were gone. Their libraries gathered dust in halls no one entered. Their gardens went to seed. Their meditation bells in the wind rang sometimes, in the particular slow rhythms that the wind had always rung them in, but there was no one left in the temples to hear them, and the sound of them rising into the mountain air became, in the absence of the monks and nuns who had made that sound meaningful, simply another feature of the empty weather, and beneath the ice at the bottom of the Southern Ocean, a boy of 12 slept, and did not know, and would not know, for 100 years. The boy slept, and did not know, and would not know for 100 years. This is the fact that must be held gently in mind as we consider the long century that passed above him, because the sleep itself was not a small thing. It was, in a sense, the great quiet around which the rest of the age turned. The world moved. The Fire Nation pressed outward. Generations were born and lived and died. Empires rose and contracted. And underneath all of it, at the bottom of the Southern Ocean, preserved in a sphere of ice that the Avatar state had formed without his consent and held closed without his knowledge, a 12-year-old boy and his flying bison drifted in a dreaming stillness that had nothing to do with any of the events that were happening above them. The 100 years were, for Aang, not experienced. They were, for the rest of the world, experienced with a fullness and a heaviness that the surviving accounts can only partially convey. Sozin did not live to see the full flowering of what he had begun. He lived, by the reckoning of the later histories, for something close to 30 years after the passing of the comet and the killing of the Air Nomads. And during those years he consolidated the initial Fire Nation advances into a more permanent occupation of certain Earth Kingdom territories on the coast nearest to his home islands. These were the first of what would eventually be called the colonies, and they were administered in Sozin's lifetime with a degree of pragmatism that suggested he was not in any particular hurry to complete the larger project of conquest he had begun. He seemed content in those years to allow the initial crime to settle into the ordinary texture of the world, to let the new arrangement become the accepted arrangement, to wait while the generation that remembered the old balance gradually died off, and was replaced by a generation that had been raised inside the shape of things as Sozin had made them. He died in his bed, at a great age, surrounded by the ceremonial attentions that a Fire Lord of his standing was entitled to expect, and the throne passed to his son, who in the ordinary course of succession was already an old man by the time it became his. Azulon came next. This is the grandson of Sozin, of the second Fire Lord of the 100-Year War, and his reign was a long one, the longest of the 3 reigns that would fill the century of Aang's absence. Azulon inherited from his father and grandfather a war that had become, by the time he took the throne, something like a permanent condition of the world rather than an active military campaign, and his contribution to it was to give the permanent condition its permanent institutional shape. Under Azulon, the Fire Nation's military became something other than a wartime expedient. It became a professional standing force, organised into a formal hierarchy, equipped from dedicated manufactories, and prepared to continue its operations indefinitely, across however many generations the work might require. The industrialisation of the Fire Nation, which had begun in Sozin's time as a rather modest adjustment to the traditional artisan economy of the islands, became under Azulon a full transformation of the nation's productive capacity. Factories were built. Coal was mined in quantities the old artisan culture would have found bewildering. The black volcanic soil of the home islands, which had for centuries been used to grow the rice and the tea and the particular fruit trees that the Fire Nation cuisine had been built around, was gradually displaced in certain regions by the grey slag of industrial waste, and the clear blue skies of the Fire Nation's older centuries began, in certain districts, to acquire a permanent discoloration from the smoke of the engines that had been set to work beneath them. This is worth dwelling upon for a moment, because it is one of the quietest tragedies of the long century, and it has a particular shape that the later scholars of this age have found it useful to sit with. The Fire Nation that prosecuted the 100-Year War was not the Fire Nation that Sozin's grandfather had grown up in. The aggression of the war itself had required, in order to be sustained, a transformation of the society that was waging it, and the transformation was in many respects a diminishment. The artists went quiet. The poets, who had been one of the proudest products of the older Fire Nation culture, either emigrated to the other nations or adjusted their work to the requirements of the new regime, which required poetry that served the war rather than poetry that served whatever poetry was ordinarily for. The small island communities, which had been the soul of Fire Nation life in the older centuries, were subordinated to the logic of the capital and the logic of production. The warmth that had once been the distinguishing quality of Fire Nation culture became, across the long reign of Azulon, something colder, a discipline rather than a hospitality, a regimentation rather than a particular quality of attention to the world. The element itself had not changed, but what the Fire Nation was doing with the element had changed, and the change was of a kind that hollowed out, from the inside, the civilization that was carrying it. The Earth Kingdom, during these same decades, was being consumed slowly rather than all at once. Azulon's strategy was not the strategy of dramatic conquest. It was the strategy of patient encroachment, in which small portions of territory were detached from the Earth Kingdom's periphery and absorbed into the colonial administration one at a time, in a rhythm that never quite produced the kind of catastrophic loss that might have provoked a unified response from the rest of the Earth Kingdom's enormous population. The great central heartland of the Earth Kingdom remained, throughout Azulon's reign, largely untouched. Ba Sing Se stood, Omashu stood. The many smaller kingdoms that together constituted the larger Earth Kingdom polity continued to function in something close to their ordinary arrangements. But the coastal provinces were lost one after another, and with each loss the Fire Nation's resources grew, and the Earth Kingdom's resources diminished, and the strategic situation across the long century shifted gradually in a direction that the Earth Kingdom's leaders were, by the nature of the gradualism, unable to fully perceive until it had already become very difficult to reverse. The water tribes, meanwhile, were treated by the Fire Nation's strategic thinking as a minor problem rather than a major one, and this is both the particular mercy and the particular cruelty of their experience of the war. The Northern Water Tribe, protected by its ice walls and its remote polar location, and its significant population of skilled waterbenders, was essentially left alone across most of the century. The Fire Nation made occasional attempts to probe its defences, but these were not prosecuted with the full weight of the Fire Nation's resources, and the Northern Tribe continued through the war in something close to its pre-war condition, a kingdom of ice and moonlight that the wider catastrophe had, by accident of geography and climate, largely passed over. The southern water tribe was less fortunate. The southern pole was warmer, its ice walls less formidable, its population smaller and more dispersed. And the Fire Nation, which had identified the southern tribe's waterbenders as a particular strategic concern, pursued across the long century a systematic campaign of raids against the southern villages, the specific purpose of which was to remove waterbenders from the population. The raids came perhaps once in every few years, in ships that arrived from the north and departed with however many waterbenders they had been able to find, leaving behind villages that were, after each raid, smaller and more defenceless than before. By the time the century was nearing its end, the entire southern water tribe had been reduced to a single village at the far edge of the southern ice, and that village contained, of its original population of several hundred, only the women and children and elders who had survived because the Fire Nation considered them not worth the effort of removing. The last waterbender of the southern tribe had been taken in one of the later raids, and the tribe that had once produced some of the finest waterbenders in the world had, by the end of Azulon's reign, no benders of any kind remaining among its depleted population. Azulon eventually died, very old, and the throne passed to his younger son, Ozai, under circumstances that the later histories have treated with some suspicion, but that were officially recorded as a natural succession. Ozai was the third Fire Lord of the war, and it was under his reign that the century finally arrived at the condition in which the boy under the ice would eventually find it. Ozai inherited a world that had been shaped by his grandfather's planning and his father's administration, and he set himself to the task of completing what they had begun. The colonies would be expanded. The Earth Kingdom's heartland would be taken. The war, which had settled into its long rhythm of slow encroachment across the century, would be brought to its conclusion within Ozai's own lifetime, and Ozai himself would rule, as he intended, not simply as Fire Lord, but as the first ruler of a unified world. A whole generation of people had grown up by the time Ozai took the throne, who had never known the world that preceded the war. The Fire Nation's citizens, taught in their schools a carefully curated version of the conflict's history, believed in the main that the war had been a necessary and even noble project, that Sozin had acted to share Fire Nation greatness with a world that had needed such sharing, that the Air Nomads had somehow been the aggressors in their own destruction, that the Earth Kingdom's occupied territories had been ungrateful rather than conquered. These were not private delusions. They were the official historical account, taught consistently across the Fire Nation's school system for 100 years, and by the time Ozai came to power, there were almost no citizens of the Fire Nation who remembered, from their own families' stories, any other version of what had happened. The Earth Kingdom, conversely, had carried the memory of the war's beginning more faithfully, but its long occupation had dulled the memory in certain ways, and its great heartland had become, across the century, a society of walls, the Sing Sea above all, in which the simplest strategy for maintaining morale was to pretend with increasing elaboration that the war was not really happening at all, and through all of this the balance of the world lay broken. This is the deeper truth that the political history of the century only partially captures. The Avatar, who had been for 10,000 years the living thread that held the four nations together, was missing. The cycle had turned, or should have turned, to water after air, and no waterborne Avatar had appeared in the world. Or if one had appeared, that Avatar had grown up somewhere in the diminishing water tribes without being identified. Because the infrastructure of identification that had previously connected the four nations had been broken by the war and could no longer do its work. The absence of the Avatar was felt, by those few who understood such things, as a quiet wrongness that accompanied every other wrongness of the age. Spirits in certain remote places were behaving in ways that the accumulated traditions of spirit lore did not know how to explain. Certain ancient shrines had gone silent. The careful balance that the cycle had maintained across the millennia had begun, in small and scattered ways, to degrade, and the degradation was of a kind that the political leaders of the four nations did not have the philosophical vocabulary to name or address. At the centre of the broken balance held in the ice that the Avatar state had formed at the moment of the original crisis, the boy who was supposed to have prevented all of this slept on. He did not age, he did not dream, or if he did, the dreams were not the dreams of any consciousness that would later be able to remember them. The ocean moved above him. The currents shifted slowly across the decades, carrying the sphere from where it had first sunk toward new regions of the southern waters. The fish of the deep passed around it. The ice did not melt, and the 100 years accumulated, one patient year upon another, above the unchanging stillness of the child at the bottom of them, a world waiting, whether it knew it or not, for the moment when the stillness would end. The world waiting, whether it knew it or not, for the moment when the stillness would end. This is perhaps the right way to describe the particular quality of the southern ice in the final year of the long century, because the ending, when it came, did not come to a village that had been preparing for it, or to a tribe that had been hoping for it, or to any larger community that had been quietly tending the expectation of the Avatar's return. It came to two siblings on a canoe. The smallness of this, the almost accidental quality of it, is worth sitting with for a moment, because it fits the pattern that the deeper shape of this story seems to prefer, the pattern by which the most significant events of the world tend to happen not in throne rooms or on battlefields, but in quiet corners, to people who had not been expecting very much from the particular morning that turned out to contain them. The village at the southern edge of the world had, by the time our story begins, been reduced to something it would once have found difficult to recognize as itself. Where once the Southern Water Tribe had maintained villages up and down the coasts of the Southern Pole, where once the hunts of the winter months had produced enough to feed substantial communities, where once the waterbenders of the tribe had been numerous enough to form schools of training and traditions of practice, by the final year of the war there remained of all of this a single village of perhaps 60 people, nearly all of them women and children and elders, with the few remaining able-bodied men having departed some years earlier to join an Earth Kingdom resistance force in the hopes of drawing Fire Nation attention away from the village that had sent them. The departed men had not returned. The village, in their absence, had learned to run itself, and did so with the particular weary competence of a community that had been managing on less and less, for longer than anyone living within it could clearly remember. Among the 60 was a girl of 14 named Katara, and her brother Sokka, who was 15. They were, by the reckoning of the village, what remained of a particular family, their father having been one of the men who had gone north, and their mother having been killed, years earlier, in one of the last Fire Nation raids on the village. Their grandmother Kanna remained, a woman of great age who had herself, in her own distant youth, travelled south from the Northern Water Tribe for reasons she preferred not to discuss in the hearing of her grandchildren. Katara was the last waterbender of the Southern Tribe. This was a fact that the village was aware of and treated with a certain gentle protectiveness, though there was no one available to train her in the use of her gift, and what practice she managed to achieve was the result of her own stubborn experimentation on the ice floes beyond the village boundary. Sokka had no bending. He had instead the particular irritable and protective temperament of a 15-year-old boy who had been made by circumstance into the closest thing his village had to an adult male, and who was trying, with the resources available to him, to be equal to the position he had not chosen. On the morning that the stillness ended, the two of them had taken the village's small canoe out to the nearer ice floes to fish. This was ordinary work. It was not a journey of any particular significance. They had gone out to fish 100 times before, together or separately, and they had returned each time with whatever small quantity of fish the waters had been willing to yield, and the day had seemed, in its opening hours, no different from the 100 days that had come before it. But the fishing was not going well, and Sokka, in his particular way, was making this fact into the occasion for an argument, and Katara, in her particular way, was responding to the argument with the accumulated frustration of a younger sister who had grown tired of her brother's certainty that the world was arranged for his management. Her water-bending, which she could not control with any precision, activated in the heat of the argument. It cracked an iceberg that was floating in the water behind them. The iceberg broke open. What rose from within the ice was at first not clearly visible. A sphere of clearer, paler ice emerged from the broken mass, and within the sphere something was glowing, and the glow was of a kind that Katara and Sokka, when they saw it, did not know what to make of. The sphere rose to the surface of the water and came to rest there, and Katara, who had always been the one in the family most willing to follow instincts that she could not immediately justify, jumped from the canoe onto the surface of the broken iceberg and struck the sphere with her brother's club. The sphere cracked. A column of light shot up from the crack into the sky and went on shooting up for longer than any of the ordinary phenomena of the southern ice would have suggested was possible, and somewhere very far to the north. In a ship on a different ocean, a young man whose story we will come to in due time saw the column of light and understood, with a clarity that the ordinary movements of his quest had not yet permitted him, that the Avatar had at last returned to the world. The sphere opened. Inside it, curled in a posture that suggested both sleep and something deeper than sleep, was a small figure. The figure was a boy, 12 years old by the measure of his body, and the body was dressed in the orange and yellow garments of an Air Nomad monk, and the skin of the boy's forehead and hands and bare feet was marked with the blue arrow tattoos of a fully tattooed airbending master, which was a thing that no boy of 12 should have had any reason to possess. Behind him, in the same sphere, was a creature that neither Katara nor Sokka had ever seen before, though the grandmother Kanna would later identify it, a flying bison, enormous and thick-furred, of the species that most people in the world currently believe to have been extinct for the better part of a century. Both of them stirred. The boy opened his eyes. The first words exchanged between Katara and the boy have been preserved in the simplest possible form by the oral traditions of the tribe, and they are worth noting for their quiet ordinariness. The boy, still dizzy from his awakening, looked up at her and asked her if she would like to go penguin sledding with him. This was, by any measure, not the first thing an observer might have expected from the moment. Katara, to her considerable credit, did not laugh at him, and did not run away. She said that she would, in fact, like to go penguin sledding, after they had taken him back to her village and made sure that he was not injured. And so the two siblings brought Aang, the last air nomad in the world, back to the village that was itself one of the last remnants of the civilization he had been born into on the back of the flying bison Appa, and as they approached the village, the children of the village came running out to meet them, because nothing so unusual had happened in the memory of any of the children, and the elders came out more slowly, and the grandmother Kanna, when she saw the boy with the blue arrows on his forehead, understood at once what the village was looking at, and sat down on the snow and did not immediately speak. What followed, across the first days of Aang's return to the waking world, was a process that the later tellings of this story have tended to compress, but that in its actual unfolding was slow and bewildered, and shaped above all by the fact that Aang, as he woke into the world of his new companions, did not know what had happened. He did not know about the comet, he did not know about the genocide, he did not know about the 100 years. What he knew was what a 12-year-old boy who had gone to sleep in a storm would know upon waking, that he had been somewhere cold, that he was now somewhere different, that he had been found by two children who seemed friendly, and by a grandmother who seemed to be looking at him in a way he could not quite interpret. The elders of the village, in quiet consultation among themselves, decided not to tell him immediately what year it was, or what had befallen his people. They decided, with a wisdom that the circumstances deserved, to let him recover his bearings first, to feed him, to let him play with the village children, to let him begin to feel that he was again in a world where he was welcome, before they broke him with the knowledge of what the world had become while he was gone. The decision could not be maintained for very long, because Aang himself, within the first days, began asking questions that the polite deflections of the elders could not entirely answer. Where were the other air nomads? When could he go home to the Southern Air Temple? Why did his bison Appa seem tired in a way he had not been tired before? The elders, led gently by Kanna, eventually understood that they could not protect him from the truth any longer, and they told him that the year was not what he thought it was, that 100 years had passed since he had entered the ice, that the air nomads, and here Kanna, with the particular tact of someone who had delivered difficult news before, said what had to be said without elaborating, were no longer in the world as he had known them, and that his home temple, so far as anyone in the village knew, stood empty upon its mountain. Aang received this information with the kind of silence that children receive information too large for them to understand. He did not, at that first telling, fully take in what was being said to him. He asked if they might go to the temple, to see for themselves. The decision was made that Katara and Sokka would accompany him on Appa to the Southern Air Temple, so that he could see with his own eyes whatever remained of the place where he had been raised. The flight to the temple took several days, across geography that had changed in ways that Aang sometimes recognized and sometimes did not, and when they arrived at the temple at last and Appa sat down upon the courtyard where Aang had played as a young monk, the silence of the place rose up around them with a weight that none of them were prepared for. The temple was intact. The walls stood. The buildings had not been burned or demolished. The meditation halls remained in the arrangements the nomads had left them in on the morning the comet arrived. But there were no monks, there were no students, there were no novices hurrying between the buildings on errands. There were no bison in the great stables, and no airbending children practicing their forms in the open courtyards. There was only the wind moving through the corridors and the slow accumulation of a century of dust in chambers where a century of life ought to have happened, and in one of the outer halls the bones of Gyatso, the old monk who had raised Aang, who had been the closest thing to a father the boy had ever known, still seated where he had sat down to meet his ending. With the remains of the Fire Nation soldiers he had evidently taken with him, scattered around him in the particular pattern that such encounters produce. Aang understood then. Whatever had been withheld from his comprehension across the short earlier days of his return resolved itself in the moment of that understanding, and the understanding was not one that the child could carry in any ordinary way, and so the Avatar state rose up around him, unbidden and uncontrollable, and the wind of the temple courtyard rose with it, and for a period of some minutes it was not clear whether any of the 3 young people present would survive what the grief of a 12-year-old boy in the Avatar state was capable of doing to the air around them. Katara calmed him. This is the central fact of that terrible afternoon, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Not by force, because force could not have reached him. Not by cleverness, because no clever word could have met him where he was. She stood in front of him in the rising winds, and she spoke to him in the simplest possible way, and she told him that he was not alone. She told him that she and Sokka were his family now, if he would have them, and that whatever the world had lost while he had been sleeping, it had not lost him, and that he still had, in her and in her brother, and in the small village at the southern edge of the world, people who were his. The Avatar state quieted. The wind fell. Aang came back to himself slowly, in a body that was again simply the body of a 12-year-old boy, and he sat down on the stone of the temple courtyard and wept for a long time, and Katara sat with him, and did not speak, and did not leave. By the time the sun set over the Southern Air Temple that evening, something had formed between the 3 of them that would become, across whatever was coming next, the spine on which everything else that this story contains would be carried. The spine that had formed between the 3 young people at the Southern Air Temple was not the only thread that was being pulled into motion by the return of the Avatar to the world. Far to the north of the southern ice, in a ship that had been traversing the polar waters in a pattern of patient and fruitless searching for the better part of 3 years, there was a young man who had seen the column of light rise from the southern horizon, and had understood, with a clarity that had eluded him across the entire span of his quest, that the moment he'd been waiting for had at last arrived. His name was Zuko. He was 16 years old, and the story of how he came to be standing on the deck of that ship at that particular moment, watching a light that no one else on the ship had yet understood the significance of, is a story that deserves to be told slowly, because the shape of it contains within it almost everything that was wrong with the Fire Nation in the final decade of the Long War, and almost everything that would, in its own time, become the quiet seed of how the war eventually ended. Zuko had been born into the royal family of the Fire Nation, in the reign of his grandfather Azulon, in a year that would later be reckoned as 13 years before the beginning of our present story. He was the first son of Prince Ozai, who at the time of Zuko's birth was the younger of Azulon's 2 sons and therefore not the heir to the throne. Zuko had a younger sister, Azula, born 2 years after him, who from a very early age displayed the particular combination of natural firebending talent and calculating temperament that would, by the time she reached her own adolescence, make her the favourite of their father and the terror of nearly everyone else in the palace. And he had a mother, Princess Ursa, who was neither royal by birth nor Fire Nation by temperament, a woman of quiet kindness who had been married to Ozai for reasons of political expediency, and who, throughout Zuko's earliest childhood, had been the one presence in his life that gave him a steady sense that he was loved for who he was rather than for what he could accomplish. The palace in which the 4 of them lived was not a place that encouraged the kind of warmth that Ursa carried. The Fire Nation court in the final decades of the war had become, by the slow accumulation of the war's requirements, a place of careful observation and carefully managed relationships, in which every child of the royal line was measured constantly against every other, and in which the ordinary affections of family were subordinated to the calculations of succession and ambition. Zuko, from his earliest years, was not a child who excelled in this environment. His fire-bending, while competent, did not develop at the pace that his sisters did. His temperament, inherited perhaps from his mother, inclined toward earnestness rather than strategy, toward directness rather than subtlety, and in a court that rewarded strategy and subtlety above all other qualities, these traits were read as weaknesses rather than as the virtues they might have been in a healthier setting. His father, Ozai, did not like him. This is the simplest way to state what the surviving accounts of Zuko's childhood make clear in various indirect ways, and it is worth stating simply because the fact of it shaped everything that followed. Ozai favoured Azula from a very early age, and favoured her openly, and treated Zuko with a coldness that the boy, for most of his childhood, did not understand and spent most of his energy trying, in the various hopeful ways that children try such things, to correct. Ursa protected him as much as she could. The particular form this protection took was not dramatic. It did not involve any direct confrontation with Ozai, which would have been beyond her power, but it was consistent, and it was real, and it gave Zuko a foundation of felt love that he would, in the years after she disappeared, draw upon without quite recognizing that he was drawing upon it. She told him stories in the evenings. She took him walking in the palace gardens, which had been maintained across the war years as one of the few remaining expressions of the older Fire Nation aesthetic, the gardens of carefully placed stones and slow-growing trees that the pre-war court had inherited from the artistic traditions of centuries earlier. She taught him, in small ways that neither of them named, that a person could be a person of the Fire Nation without having to be the kind of person that his father was trying to make him into. She disappeared when Zuko was 11. The circumstances of her disappearance were not explained to him at the time, and were not fully explained to him for many years afterward, and belong to a part of this story that we will come to in due course. What Zuko knew, as an 11-year-old boy waking one morning to a house in which his mother was simply no longer present, was that his grandfather Azulon had died the previous night, that his father had somehow become the Fire Lord instead of his uncle, that his mother was gone, and that no one in the palace was willing or able to give him a clear account of what had happened. He carried the unexplained loss across the following years without speaking of it to anyone, because there was no one in the palace he could have spoken of it to, and the particular weight of carrying such a loss in such a silence was part of what shaped him into the young man he was becoming by the time he reached his 13th year. It was in his 13th year that the event occurred that would define the next 3 years of his life. Ozai, now Fire Lord, had permitted Zuko to attend a meeting of the highest war council, as part of what the Fire Lord had framed to himself as the appropriate continuing education of an heir. Zuko, who had been warned by his uncle Iroh not to speak during the meeting, had listened to the council's plans with growing distress, as a general proposed the deliberate sacrifice of an entire division of young and inexperienced Fire Nation soldiers as a diversionary tactic. Zuko had spoken up. He had challenged the general's plan openly in the presence of the Fire Lord and the entire War Council, on the grounds that the soldiers whose lives were being casually spent were citizens of the Fire Nation who deserved better from their leadership than to be treated as disposable. The response to this speaking up was that Zuko, by the protocols of Fire Nation honour, had challenged the general to a duel, an Agni Kai, the traditional fire-bending combat by which disputes of honour were settled in the Fire Nation tradition. Zuko had accepted the challenge, assuming that it was the general he would be fighting. When he arrived in the arena on the appointed day, he discovered that the honour he had offended was not the general's but his father's, that by speaking out in the Fire Lord's war room he had insulted the Fire Lord himself, and that it was therefore the Fire Lord with whom he would be duelling. Zuko, who was 13 years old and who was being asked to fight his own father in front of the assembled Fire Nation court, refused. He knelt, he wept, he begged his father's forgiveness and asked to be excused from the duel. Ozai did not excuse him. Ozai interpreted the refusal to fight as an additional insult, as cowardice on top of insubordination, and he proceeded with the duel against his kneeling son. He walked across the arena to where Zuko was kneeling, and he held out his hand, and he burned the left side of his son's face with a fire hot enough to scar the boy permanently. And then, with the court watching in the absolute silence that such moments produce, Ozai pronounced the sentence that would shape the next 3 years of Zuko's life. The prince was banished from the Fire Nation. He would not be permitted to return until he had captured the Avatar and delivered him to his father, as proof of his worthiness to resume his place in the royal line. The condition was, in the context of what was then known about the Avatar's whereabouts, essentially a sentence of permanent exile. No one had seen the Avatar in 100 years. Most people in the Fire Nation believed the Avatar no longer existed, or had ceased to be reborn after the destruction of the Air Nomads. Ozai was sending his son to hunt a ghost, and both of them knew it, and Ozai intended it that way. Zuko left the Fire Nation on a ship. He was permitted a crew and a single senior advisor, and that senior advisor was his uncle Iroh, who chose to go with him. This is the other central fact of Zuko's exile, and it is a fact worth dwelling upon for a moment, because Iroh's presence beside Zuko across the 3 years of the exile was, in the deeper shape of this story, one of the most important quiet circumstances that the war had produced. Iroh was Ozai's older brother, and would by rights have been the Fire Lord himself had things unfolded differently. He had been, in his younger years, one of the finest generals the Fire Nation had ever produced. The Dragon of the West, who had led the siege of Ba Sing Se for 600 days, and who had come closer than any Fire Nation commander before or since to breaking the great walled city of the Earth Kingdom. And then, during that siege, his only son Lu Ten had been killed, and something in Iroh had broken, or had perhaps rather finally become whole, and he had returned from the siege a different man. A man who had walked away from his own ambitions, who had relinquished his claim to the throne, and who had spent the years since in a kind of quiet philosophical retirement, drinking tea and playing Pei-Shou and speaking, when he spoke at all. With a gentleness that most of the Fire Nation court found either admirable or contemptible, depending on the temperament of the observer. Iroh did not, in any direct way, try to change Zuko across the 3 years of their exile. He did not lecture him. He didn't tell him that the quest his father had set him was impossible, or that the relationship between Zuko and Ozai was one that no successful quest could ever repair. He simply accompanied him. He drank his tea in the mornings, he played Pei-Shou in the evenings, he offered small pieces of counsel, often framed as proverbs, that Zuko, in the urgency of his quest and the intensity of his anger, and the unhealed pain of his scar, mostly dismissed as the irrelevant meanderings of a retired old man, and he waited, with the particular patience that belonged to him, for whatever future moment the boy would eventually need what the old man was quietly carrying on his behalf. The quest itself had gone across the 3 years, 3. Exactly as one might have expected a quest for a ghost to go. The ship had travelled through every sea of the known world. Zuko had followed rumours of the Avatar's possible reappearance to places that had turned out to contain no Avatars, and had endured the small and large humiliations that such futile journeying inevitably produces. He had become, by the time of our present story, a young man of 16 whose entire adolescence had been spent on a single ship, pursuing a single hope, carrying within his body the scar that his father had given him, and within his mind the particular complicated grief of having been banished by the one person whose approval he had spent his childhood trying to earn. And on a morning in the southern polar waters, he had seen a column of light rise from a distant horizon, and he had understood, with the clarity of a man whose 3 years of patient searching had finally intersected with a visible sign, that the Avatar had returned to the world, and that his ship must now turn south and must reach the source of the light before any other Fire Nation force in the region reached it first. The quest was no longer the quest of a ghost. The quest was now real and urgent and possible. And in the particular shape of Zuko's interior life, the possibility of success carried with it the possibility of return, the possibility long dreamed of and long despaired of, that if he could only complete this one impossible task, his father might receive him again as a son. He gave the order for the ship to turn, and the ship, with Iroh sitting in the cabin playing Pei-Shou against himself, and thinking his own quiet thoughts, moved south through the cold water toward the small village at the edge of the world, where the Avatar he had been hunting for 3 years was, at that very moment, eating seal jerky with a 14-year-old girl who had become, only a few days earlier, his closest friend. The ship moved south through the cold water toward the small village at the edge of the world, and the moment of its arrival was not, in the event, quite the moment that Zuko had been preparing himself for across 3 years of futile searching. The village was where the light had come from. The Avatar was in it. But the particular shape of what followed, a brief and almost comical attempt by Zuko to take the Avatar by force, a clumsy escape on the back of a flying bison, a confused pursuit across the southern ice, established, in its first small iteration, the pattern that would define the relationship between the hunter and the hunted across the months that followed. Zuko would find Aang. Aang would escape. Zuko would follow. The chase would continue, across seas and coastlines and the long green reaches of the Earth Kingdom's interior, and it would continue for most of the year that lay ahead, and neither of them, in the middle of it, would quite be able to see how the chase itself was changing both of them in ways that the chase itself could not have anticipated. But the chase would have to wait because Aang, in the first days of his freedom from the ice, had a more immediate task before him. The monks who had raised him had been clear, in the curriculum of his interrupted training, that an avatar's work required mastery of all 4 elements, and that mastery could only be learned by travelling to each of the 4 nations and studying with the appropriate teachers. Aang was, at the moment of his awakening, a master only of the air. He needed to learn the other 3, and he needed to learn them in the proper order, which meant that his next element was water, and his next destination was the Northern Water Tribe, where the teachers who could instruct him in that element still existed. Katara, who had long dreamed of receiving proper waterbending training herself, and who had understood at once that she would be travelling with Aang now rather than returning to her village, was in agreement. Sokka, who was not particularly enthusiastic about any of this, but who was not prepared to let his sister travel across the world without him, was outvoted by circumstances, and so the 3 of them turned Appa north and began the long journey across the Earth Kingdom that would, across the months that followed, take them into some of the deeper strangenesses of the world Aang had been away from. The journey north deserves its own telling, because it was in the slow accumulation of small encounters across that journey that Aang began to understand, in a way that the initial shock of the Southern Air Temple had not permitted him to understand, what 100 years of war had done to the world he had woken into. The Earth Kingdom was occupied in its peripheries and intact in its heartland. But the intactness of the heartland was itself a kind of fragility, because the heartland had spent the century pretending with increasing elaboration that the war was not really happening, and the pretense had produced a population that was technically at peace, while actually carrying, in the deeper textures of its daily life, all the symptoms of a people under prolonged siege. Villages they passed through were poorer than the histories Aang remembered would have suggested. Roads were less well maintained. The great wandering communities of traders who had once moved freely between the nations had been reduced, by the various economic disruptions of the war, to a handful of persistent remnants operating in the margins of the occupied territories. And the war itself, in the form of Fire Nation patrols and garrisons and the particular quiet menace that occupied populations learned to carry in their shoulders, was visible in places that the Aang of a century earlier would have found it difficult to imagine a Fire Nation soldier ever setting foot in. They had adventures along the way. This is perhaps the simplest way to describe the texture of the journey, because the word adventure was, in the ordinary usage of the Earth Kingdom, the word that might have been applied to what they were doing if one chose to look at it in the brightest possible light. They met King Bumi at Omashu, the old and eccentric ruler of one of the last independent cities of the Earth Kingdom, who turned out to have been, in a previous life, a boyhood friend of Aang's from before the freezing, one of the very few people still alive in the world who remembered Aang from when Aang had been simply a young, airbending monk rather than a figure of legend. They passed through villages where the locals believed Aang was a statue come to life, because the statues of Aang that had been made during his lifetime were in many cases the last visible trace of his former existence, and a living 12-year-old arriving in such a village produced reactions that ranged from superstition to cautious wonder. They encountered Jet and his freedom fighters, a group of young Earth Kingdom refugees who had turned their grief for what the war had taken from them into a violence that Aang and Katara, each in their own way, eventually recognized as something they could not follow. They crossed the Great Divide. They visited the Spirit Oasis. They came, by slow degrees, to understand themselves as a group, as 3 young people who had been thrown together by circumstance and who were becoming, across the long days of travel and the shared meals around small fires and the accumulated small dangers that they had come through together, a family in something other than the biological sense. Aang's training continued as they travelled. Katara, whose own waterbending was largely self-taught, worked with Aang in whatever rivers and ponds they passed, and the 2 of them learned together, teacher and student and also simply friends. the basic forms of an art that neither of them had had the benefit of formal instruction in. The bending was slow, the progress was fitful, but there was a particular quality to the way they practiced it, side by side in the evening light of whatever encampment they had made, that Sokka, watching them from his perch on Appa, or from wherever he had set himself to cook the evening meal, came eventually to understand as one of the most important things that was happening on the journey. Aang was becoming the Avatar gradually, Katara was becoming a waterbender gradually, and the three of them together, without any of them having made a conscious decision that this was what they were doing, were becoming the thing that the world required if the war was to be ended, a small and improbable company of young people who had, between them, begun the work that 100 years of adult calculation had failed to begin. They arrived at the Northern Water Tribe after several months of travel, in the depth of the northern winter, and the city that greeted them was something Aang had not been prepared for. The Northern Water Tribe had been largely untouched by the war, and the city of Agnikela, protected by its ice walls and its polar isolation, had continued to develop across the century of the war's continuation in something close to the direction its older culture had been going before the war began. It was a city of ice, yes, but the ice had been worked by generations of waterbending craftsmen into shapes that were genuinely beautiful. A city of canals and bridges and palaces, whose walls glowed blue in the particular slow northern light, whose streets were quiet with the muffling of snow, whose people had maintained across the war the various traditions that their southern cousins had, under the pressure of the Fire Nation raids, been unable to preserve. To arrive in such a city, after the long journey through the occupied and anxious lands of the Earth Kingdom, was to arrive in something like a memory, a remnant of what the world had been before the war, carried forward unchanged by the accident of geographical remoteness. The chief of the Northern Water Tribe was a man named Arnuk, and Arnuk received the travellers with the traditional hospitality of his people. Aang was welcomed as the Avatar, Katara and Sokka were welcomed as his companions, and arrangements were made for Aang's training with Master Pakku, the chief waterbending master of the tribe, a man of advanced years whose particular combination of technical excellence and social conservatism would, in the first days of Aang's training, produce an unexpected complication. Pakku, following the traditions of the northern tribe, taught waterbending only to men. When Katara, who had travelled thousands of miles in the hope of at last receiving proper instruction, presented herself for training alongside Aang, Pakku refused. Katara, who had spent the whole of her 14 years carrying losses that the world had not consulted her about, did not accept the refusal. She challenged Pakku to a duel. The duel was not an even match. Pakku's mastery was the accumulated work of decades. But the intensity of Katara's bending surprised him, and in the course of the duel Pakku noticed a particular pendant she wore. A pendant that turned out to have belonged to her grandmother, who turned out to have been Pakku's own beloved in his youth, before Kanna had fled the northern tribe to escape an arranged marriage and had travelled south to the tribe where she had, in the long fullness of her life, become the grandmother of the girl now standing before him with a cold anger in her eyes and a water-bending prodigy's hands. Pakku, in the quiet that followed the duel, agreed to train her. He agreed also, in a smaller but not insignificant act of mercy, to revise the tradition of the tribe in respect of the training of women. It was during these weeks of training that Aang and Sokka both came to know the chief's daughter, Princess Yue, and in particular it was Sokka who came to know her, with the particular quiet intensity that belongs to 15-year-old boys meeting the first person they will ever seriously love. Yue was a young woman of 16, beautiful in the pale and luminous way that all things in the northern tribe seem to be beautiful, engaged against her own will to a young man of the tribe whom she did not love, but had been promised to for reasons of politics. What Sokka learned gradually across their first conversations, and what Yue told him eventually in a quiet moment beside the spirit oasis at the centre of the city, was that she was not simply an ordinary young woman. She had been born dead. Her parents had brought her to the spirit oasis, and the moon spirit that lived in that place had given her life, had transferred into her small failing body a portion of its own essence, so that she had grown up carrying within her a fragment of the moon itself, alive by borrowed light, with her white hair and her pale skin as the visible signs of the gift she had been given. Sokka listened to this, and accepted it, and continued to love her anyway, with the particular uncomplicated loyalty that was among his best qualities. What neither of them yet understood was the shape of what the borrowed gift was going to require her to give back. the Fire Nation arrived at the Northern Water Tribe in the middle of the winter. The fleet was enormous, the largest assault ever mounted on the Northern Tribe across the entire span of the war, and it was led by Admiral Zhao, a Fire Nation commander whose ambition had, in the years preceding this assault, become untethered from the ordinary constraints even of Fire Nation imperial thinking. Zhao had studied the spiritual history of the water tribes. He had discovered, through research in the great library of Wan Shi Tong hidden beneath the sands of the Siwang Desert, that the moon spirit and the ocean spirit lived in the physical world in specific avatars, that they took the forms of two koi fish, one black and one white, who swam in an endless circle in the spirit oasis at the centre of the Northern Water Tribe, and that the killing of the moon spirit's physical form would, by the deep logic of the cosmology, remove waterbending from the world. Zhao's plan was not simply to defeat the Northern Tribe, his plan was to kill the moon. The battle was long. It extended across several days, with the ice walls of the city proving their worth, and the waterbenders of the tribe fighting with a ferocity that the Fire Nation fleet had not quite expected. And yet by the third night Zhao himself had penetrated to the spirit oasis, and had captured the white koi fish in a bag of his own making, and had demonstrated by a single application of firebending that he was prepared to kill it. The moon itself, in the sky above the city, flickered. The waterbending of every waterbender in the tribe weakened, and Zhao, with the particular terrible satisfaction of a man who had discovered a god and had decided to end it, killed the white koi. The moon went red, and then black, and then was no longer present in the sky, and across the city and across the world the waterbenders felt, in their hands, the element leaving them. Yue knew what she had to do. This is the central act of quiet courage in the whole of this act, and it deserves to be set down with the plainness it deserves. She went to the spirit oasis. She stood beside the pool in which the remaining koi fish, the black one, was now alone. She put her hands into the water. She returned to the moon spirit the life that the moon spirit had given her 16 years earlier in this same place, and her body, which had been alive only by that borrowed light, quieted, and her hair began to darken as the life passed out of it, and she fell gently backward into Sokka's arms, and Sokka, who had loved her for all of 2 weeks, held her as she went, and the moon rose again full and bright above the northern city. The waterbending returned to the hands of the waterbenders, the tide of the battle turned, and in the ocean outside the city, where the remaining koi fish, the ocean spirit in his physical form, had fused with Aang in the avatar state, a vast and terrible figure rose out of the water, a towering manifestation of grief and fury that was, in a certain sense, what the ocean spirit had always been beneath the small quiet form of the koi, and that was also, in another sense, what the avatar became when the balance of the world had been violated beyond what his 12-year-old mind could bear. The figure moved through the Fire Nation fleet with the particular impersonal destructiveness of weather. Ships were swept under. Soldiers were carried into the cold water and did not emerge. Admiral Zhao was dragged by the water itself into the depths. And by the time the figure subsided and Aang was returned to himself and the ocean spirit had returned to its koi form beside the silent black pool, the assault on the Northern Water Tribe was finished, and Aang stood on the shore of the spirit oasis holding the memory of what he had just done with a heaviness that 12 years of life had not prepared him to carry. The tribe had been saved, but Yue was gone. And the world had been reminded, in the most costly way it could be reminded, that when balance is forced to defend itself, the defence is never free. You have travelled a very long road tonight. Not the road of battles or of thrones taken and lost, but the deeper road, the one that runs beneath all of those things, through the oldest music of the world, and the slow, patient turning of a single soul across the ages, through the quiet choice of a thief in a forest clearing who decided, without knowing why, to help the one he thought was losing, through 10,000 years of 4 nations learning what their elements had come to teach them, through a boy of 12 asleep in the ice at the bottom of the southern sea while the world above him forgot how to remember him, through the small kitchen lamps of a polar village where the last of a tribe still lit their fires against the dark. What this story carries is not power. It is the knowledge that balance, once broken, can be mended, that the smallest voice, held with fidelity, is never lost in the larger music, that the cycle turns and turns again, and what was taken from the world is not always forever gone. You have heard the music tonight, you have walked a little way along the road, and now the fire is low and the stars are very clear, and the four winds are settling into their evening quiet, and somewhere, in a garden that has learned again how to be a garden, a boy with blue arrows on his forehead is sitting with his friends, and the tea is warm and the balance is restored. Rest now. The watch is over. The cycle turns gently toward morning, and all is well, and all shall be well, and the wheel goes ever, ever on.